Hangar 4 stood dressed in ceremony. Flags hung in precise intervals along steel beams. A backdrop bearing the Navy SEAL trident loomed behind the podium. Rows of folding chairs stretched toward the back, filled with officers in dress whites, families in their Sunday best, and a handful of civilians who'd earned invitations through proximity to greatness. At the front, Admiral Rhea Blackwood moved with the kind of energy that bends rooms toward her. 42 years old, trim and commanding in her service dress blues. She worked the crowd with practiced ease, her remarks sharp enough to draw laughter, warm enough to feel personal. She was midway through a story about resilience when her gaze snagged on a figure at the back, a man in a worn canvas jacket, standing beside a teenage girl clutching a cello case. Rhea paused, smiled with surgical precision, and asked the question that would unravel everything. "What was your call sign, hero?" The room rippled with polite laughter. The man looked up slowly. His voice came quiet. "Deliberate Iron Ghost." Silence dropped like a curtain. Several veterans straightened in their seats. Rhea's expression froze for half a breath before she recovered. The dawn air at West Haven Harbor smelled of salt and diesel and honest work. Thorne Merrick moved through the boatyard with the efficiency of a man who'd spent years making every motion count. His hands, scarred and calloused, worked a torque wrench with the kind of precision that spoke to muscle memory older than his current profession. In the corner of the small office attached to the main shed, a folded triangle of stars and stripes rested on a high shelf beside a battered metal box that hadn't been opened in years. Lana appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, hers with too much sugar, his black. They didn't need words for this part of the morning. It was their rhythm built over 16 years of just the 2 of them. She set his mug on the workbench and pulled a permission slip from her backpack, the paper already creased from a week in her binder. The West Haven High School Orchestra had been invited to perform at the naval base as part of a fundraiser for the arts program. Principal Finch needed $10,000 by June, or the music department would be gutted. The field trip required a parent's signature. Thorne scanned the form, his eyes catching on the words, "Naval Base," and holding there for a fraction too long. Then he reached for a pen and signed with the kind of decisiveness that ended internal debates. That evening, the school held a parent meeting in the cafeteria. Principal Finch stood beneath flickering fluorescent lights and explained the crisis with the weary honesty of an educator who'd fought this fight too many times. The arts program was first on the chopping block, always was. Adria Collins, the school librarian who also assisted with the orchestra, watched Thorne from across the room. She noticed things others missed, the way he stood with his back to the wall, the way his eyes mapped the exits before Saturday, the way he carried himself with a posture that didn't match his coveralls. Around town, people had started asking questions. Thorne never answered them. He fixed boats, paid his bills on time, showed up to every one of Lana's concerts, and kept his past exactly where it belonged, buried. That night, after Lana went to bed, Thorne stood at the window overlooking the harbor. In the distance, the lights of naval vessels blinked against the dark water. Something in his expression shifted, a tightening around the eyes that Lana would have recognized if she'd been awake. She'd learned over the years that her father avoided anything connected to the military, parades, ceremonies, Veterans Day events. He always had a reason, and she'd stopped asking why. But this was different. This was for her. He'd go to the base, sign the forms, stand in the back, and leave. Simple. The decision felt clean until he remembered that nothing involving his old life had ever been simple. The school bus rolled through the checkpoint at 800 hours. Thorne had volunteered to chaperone, a decision that surprised Principal Finch and pleased Lana in a way she didn't quite say out loud. As they approached the gate, Thorne walked the other parents through the security process with a fluency that made Adria's eyebrows rise slightly. He knew the protocol without asking, moved through the steps like a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Once inside, he didn't need to check the signs to know which direction led to Hangar 4. His internal compass adjusted automatically, and he guided the group with quiet authority that felt both natural and strangely out of place for a small-town boat mechanic. Commander Sable, a trim officer with observant eyes, watched from near the entrance as the civilian group approached. She noticed Thorn immediately, not because he stood out, but because he was trying very hard not to. The way he scanned for exits, the way he positioned himself with clear sightlines, the way he moved. The hangar had been transformed into an exhibition space. Photographs lined the walls, most of them carefully sanitized to remove operational details, while still conveying the intensity of the work. Display boards detailed the history of naval special warfare, the selection process, the ethos of teamwork and sacrifice. Near the front, a small stage had been set up for the orchestra. Lana and her classmates assembled their instruments, adjusting stands and tuning strings with the focused chaos of teenagers doing something they actually cared about. The cello looked almost too large in Lana's hands, but when she drew the bow across the strings during warm-up, the sound that emerged was assured and mature. Admiral Rhea Blackwood entered through a side door, flanked by 2 aides. At 42, she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with presence. She moved through the VIP section, shaking hands, her energy filling the space like a tide coming in. When the orchestra began to play, the room settled into attention. Lana's solo emerged from the adagio with the kind of aching clarity that made people forget to breathe. Rhea listened with the expressionless intensity of someone who'd learned to armor herself in public. Afterward came the meet and greet. Rhea approached the student group with practiced warmth, asking questions that sounded personal, but weren't. When she reached Thorn, something in her demeanor shifted. Maybe it was the way he stood. Maybe it was the way he didn't seek her attention. "You served, didn't you?" She made it sound casual, friendly. Thorn offered a non-committal nod. "Long time ago." Rhea smiled, and there was an edge to it now. Something playful and cutting at once. "Let me guess. Motor pool supply." A few people laughed. It was meant to be lighthearted. Sable, standing nearby, saw Thorn's jaw tightened for just a moment before he controlled it. Lana's hand found the edge of her cello case and held on. Rhea leaned in slightly, playing to the crowd. Now, her voice carrying that tone of authority mixed with entertainment that people like her wielded like a weapon. "Come on, don't be shy." "What was your call sign, hero?" The question hung in the air. Thorn met her eyes, his expression neutral, and spoke 2 words that changed the temperature of the room. "Iron Ghost." Someone dropped a glass. The sound of it shattering on concrete seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. One of the older officers, a master chief with 30 years in, straightened so fast his chair scraped. A few people exchanged glances, uncertain whether they'd heard correctly. Rhea's smile remained fixed, but something behind her eyes shifted, recalculating. Commander Sable moved closer, her interest now sharp and professional. She addressed Thorn with careful respect. "Sir, do you still have any mission currency?" "Challenge coins." "Insignia." Thorn reached into his jacket pocket and produced a single coin. It was worn smooth at the edges from years of being carried. He placed it in Sable's palm without ceremony. She turned it over, examining the markings, and her face went still. The coin matched a description she'd seen in classified briefings, tied to an operation that wasn't supposed to exist in official records. Rhea recovered quickly, her voice taking on a diplomatic polish. "Thank you for your service." The words were correct, but they landed cold. Several junior officers nearby moved almost unconsciously into positions of respect, a subtle difference that Rhea noticed and clearly didn't appreciate. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't immediately control. Lana stared at her father, as if seeing him for the first time. The quiet man who fixed boats and made her breakfast and taught her to tie knots had just become someone else entirely. Or maybe he'd been that person all along, and she'd never known. Across the hangar, phones were already coming out. Not to take pictures, that was forbidden, but to send texts. Within minutes, the name Iron Ghost was moving through secure channels, pulling up fragments of after-action reports, mission summaries, and a set of records that had been heavily redacted, for reasons no one had ever fully explained. Adrea appeared at Lana's side, her hand gentle on the girl's shoulder. "Breathe," she whispered, just like before a performance. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Lana nodded, her hands shaking slightly. Thorn remained still, his expression unreadable. While the room reorganized itself around him, Rhea brought the event to a polite close, thanking everyone for their participation and support. But her eyes kept returning to Thorn with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like calculation. As the crowd began to disperse, Sable made a point of shaking Thorn's hand. "We should talk," she said quietly. "Not here, not now, but soon." Thorn nodded once. End of 7. Lana moved to his side, and they walked out together, father and daughter, through a gauntlet of eyes that saw them differently than they had an hour before. That night, back in the small house attached to the boatyard, Thorn pulled a chair to the center of the living room and climbed up to retrieve the metal box from the high shelf. Lana sat on the couch, her cello resting against her shoulder, waiting. He set the box on the coffee table between them and opened it for the first time in years. Inside was the folded flag, a photograph with faces deliberately blurred, the Damascus coin, and a set of dog tags he'd never been able to throw away. Thorn spoke slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man who'd kept them locked down for more than a decade. The mission had been a direct action raid, targeting a high-V Valuo individual in a compound outside Damascus. Intelligence suggested minimal security, quick in and out. But when they arrived, the situation was wrong. The target wasn't there. Instead, they found 4 hostages, 3 of them children, bound in a basement room. The rules of engagement were clear: abort, extract, let higher command reassess. But Thorn had made a different call. They took the hostages. The exfiltration point was supposed to be clear. It wasn't. Someone had been waiting for them, not random enemy fighters stumbling onto their position. A planned ambush, coordinated, disciplined. The kind of setup that only happens when someone knows exactly where you're going to be and exactly when you're going to be there. 3 men went down in the first 60 seconds. Riley took rounds to the chest. Donovan died covering the children. Kramer bled out before they could get him to the rally point. Thorn carried 2 of the kids himself, moving through 11 kilometers of hostile territory, with nothing but a sidearm and the will to keep them breathing. The official report told a different story. It blamed the team for disobeying orders. It framed the ambush as the predictable result of poor tactical judgment. It buried the fact that someone in the command chain had either failed catastrophically or, worse, had leaked their position. Rhea Blackwood had been the mission coordinator that night. Young, ambitious, and newly promoted into a role that gave her access to operational details and the authority to make real-time decisions. When the dust settled and the bodies came home, she'd been the one to shape the narrative, bold enough to take risks, sharp enough to cover mistakes, ruthless enough to let 3 dead men carry the blame so her career could continue its upward trajectory. Adrea had shared a piece of the story earlier that day. After pulling Lana aside, her older brother had been one of the hostages. He still talked about the ghost who carried him through the desert, the man whose face he'd barely seen, but whose voice he'd never forgotten. Lana sat in silence for a long time after her father finished speaking. Then she set down her cello, crossed the room, and put her arms around him. The embrace was fierce and wordless. The kind of hug that says everything language can't. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. What happens now? Thorn looked at the flag, the coin, the blurred photograph. I don't know, but whatever happens, you come first. Lana nodded. She understood. Her father had spent 16 years building a quiet life because silence had been the only way to keep moving forward. But silence had a cost. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to pay a different price. The investigators arrived 3 days later. NCIS and the Inspector General's office, working in coordination. They met Thorn at the boatyard. Away from the house, away from Lana, Commander Sable acted as the liaison. Her presence a signal that this wasn't an ambush. Thorn laid out his terms before he said a word about Damascus. His identity stayed sealed. His daughter stayed out of it. His current life remained untouched. They agreed. Over the next 6 hours, Thorn walked them through the operation in granular detail. He described the compound layout, the movement patterns of the enemy fighters, the sound of the children crying in the dark. He explained the decision tree that led him to take the hostages instead of aborting. He walked them through the ambush, the way the enemy had been positioned, the precision of their fields of fire. It wasn't a lucky engagement. It was a planned kill zone. The investigators cross-referenced his account with old communications logs, satellite imagery, and testimony from surviving team members who'd been interviewed separately over the years. Patterns emerged. Inconsistencies in the official record became harder to ignore. The abort order had come 47 minutes before the team encountered the hostages, but the timeline didn't allow for that gap unless the command center had known about the hostages long before the team did. Radio intercepts showed breaks in communication at intervals that suggested deliberate signal management rather than technical failure, and the enemy's positioning at the exfiltration point matched a route that had been discussed in a permission briefing, information that should never have left secure channels. The story broke quietly at first. A military news outlet reported that Admiral Blackwood had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. No details, no accusations, just enough to start the machinery of speculation. Within 48 hours, the base announced a substantial donation to West Haven High School's arts program, a gesture framed as community outreach, but understood by anyone paying attention as something closer to penance. Lana returned to school and tried to keep her head down. It didn't work. Kids asked questions. Teachers looked at her differently. She spent her free periods in the music room, practicing scales until her fingers ached, using the cello as an anchor against the storm. Thorn moved through his days with the heightened awareness of a man who knew he'd become a target. He checked locks. He varied his routes. He installed cameras. The old reflexes came back easily, muscle memory that had never really faded. Adrija stopped by the boatyard one evening with a thermos of coffee and a bag of sandwiches. She sat on an overturned crate and watched Thorn work for a while before speaking. "My brother wants to meet you properly. He's tried a dozen times to find you over the years." Thorn didn't look up from the engine block he was reassembling. "He doesn't owe me anything." "Maybe not, but some ghosts come back so we can understand why we survived." Thorn set down his wrench and finally met her eyes. "I'm not a ghost. I'm just a guy who made a call and got lucky." Adrea smiled, sad and knowing. "No, you're a guy who made a call and carried the weight of it for 16 years. That's not luck. That's something else." She left the thermos and went home. Thorn drank the coffee slowly, watching the sun set over the harbor, and wondered if the weight was finally about to shift. They came on a Saturday morning. 2 men, both in their 50s, both moving with the careful economy of people who'd learned to navigate the world with bodies that didn't work the way they used to. Weston had a carbon fiber prosthetic where his left leg used to be. Archer carried himself with the slight hitch of someone with a fused spine. They stood at the edge of the boatyard just outside the fence, waiting. Thorn saw them from the office window and knew immediately who they were. He walked out slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped a few feet away. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Weston grinned, the kind of grin that carried 16 years of grief and relief and brotherhood, and said, "Ghost, you stubborn bastard, you're actually alive." They shook hands in silence. Men like them didn't need words for this part. The reunion was equal parts joy and mourning, a strange alchemy of emotions that couldn't be separated cleanly. They talked for hours, not about the mission, not at first. They talked about the years after Weston's medical discharge, his struggle with painkillers, the marriage that didn't survive, Archer's transition to contracting work, the nightmares that still came some nights, the grandkid who just learned to walk. They talked about Riley and Donovan and Kramer, the men who didn't get to grow old, whose families had spent 16 years believing their loved ones died because of bad leadership and reckless decisions. They deserve better, Weston said quietly. Their families, they deserve to know the truth. Archer nodded. We all do. That afternoon, Commander Sable arrived with an update. The investigation had uncovered communications that placed Rhea Blackwood at the center of the intelligence failure. She'd known the compound was under heavier surveillance than the initial brief suggested. She'd known the exfiltration route had been compromised, and she'd made a calculated decision to proceed anyway, betting that a successful capture of the high V-value target would outweigh the risks. When the mission went sideways and men died, she'd shaped the narrative to protect herself and her career trajectory. It was a gamble, a cold, ambitious gamble, and it had worked for 16 years. Lana came home from orchestra practice and found her father sitting at the kitchen table with 2 strangers and a naval officer. She sat down her cello case and listened as they explained what was happening. Her eyes moved between the men, taking in the scars, the weariness, the unspoken bond that connected them. When they finished, she asked the only question that mattered to her. "Is this going to hurt, Dad?" Weston looked at Thorne, then back at Lana. "No, kid. This is going to help him." Thorne wasn't so sure. He'd built 16 years of peace on the foundation of silence. Digging up the past meant risking everything he'd built. But Lana surprised him. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and said, "You should go to Washington. When they ask you to testify or whatever, you should go." Thorne studied his daughter's face, searching for doubt. He didn't find any. "You'll be okay here. I'll be fine. Adrea said she'd check in. And besides, I've got a concert next week. Someone needs to hold down the fort." She smiled, and it was small, but real. "Go finish it, Dad. For them. For you." Thorne felt something in his chest unknot slightly. He looked at Weston and Archer, these men who'd walked through fire with him, and nodded. They spent the evening making plans. Adrea agreed to manage the boatyard while Thorne was gone. Sable coordinated the logistics with the IG's office, and Lana practiced her adagio, the notes rising through the small house like a prayer. Before bed, Thorne taught her the box breathing technique he'd learned in selection. 4 counts in, hold for 4. 4 counts out, hold for 4. "It's for when your heart is racing and you need to slow everything down," he said. "Works for combat. Works for concerts. Works for life." Lana tried it, her breath evening out, her shoulders dropping. "Does it work for scary conversations in Washington?" Thorne smiled. "We'll find out." The phone call came at 2 a.m. Unknown number. Thorne answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical, unrecognizable. The message was clear. "Drop it. Walk away. You've got a kid to think about." Thorne hung up without responding. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, he sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a notepad, working through contingencies, threat assessment, response protocols, evacuation routes. The old training came back like riding a bike, and he hated how natural it felt. In the morning, Lana found him at the table, the notepad covered in diagrams and shorthand she didn't understand. She poured herself juice and sat across from him. Bad night. Complicated night. She didn't push. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from years of learning each other's rhythms. Later, she spent the afternoon in the music room at school, working through the climactic section of the adagio. It was the hardest part. The place where the emotion peaked and threatened to overwhelm the technique. She kept losing the thread, her bowel pressure inconsistent, her vo shaky. Thorne showed up halfway through her practice session. He sat in the back row of the empty auditorium and listened. When she finished and looked up, frustrated, he walked down to the stage. "You're thinking too much," he said. "What do you mean?" "The notes are right. The technique is solid. But you're in your head." Instead of trusting your hands, he demonstrated the box breathing pattern again. Before the hard section, take a breath. 4-4-4. Let your body remember what it knows. Lana tried it. This time, when she reached the climax, her bow moved with clean, confident strokes. The sound filled the room, aching and perfect. Thorne smiled. There it is. They sat on the edge of the stage afterward, legs dangling. Lana leaned her head on her father's shoulder. "Are you scared about Washington?" Thorne considered the question carefully. "I'm scared of making the wrong call and having other people pay for it. That's the part that's hard. But you made the right call. You saved those kids. I did, but I also lost 3 men. And no matter how right the call was, I still carry them." Lana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think that's what makes it the right call, that you still carry them." Thorne turned to look at his daughter, this impossibly wise 16-year-old who somehow knew how to say the exact thing he needed to hear. "When did you get so smart?" "I had a pretty good teacher." That night, Thorne packed a small bag, clean shirt, dress slacks, the folded flag in a separate cloth case. He set a go bag by the door just in case, supplies for a fast evacuation if things went wrong. He didn't think he'd need it, but he'd learned a long time ago that the things you don't prepare for are the things that kill you. Lana hugged him before bed, holding on a little longer than usual. "Come back," she said. "I always do." The hearing room in the Pentagon was smaller than Thorne had expected. Wood paneling, flags, a long conference table with microphones. Weston and Archer sat to his left. Across the room, representatives from NCIS, JAG, and the Secretary of the Navy's office arranged folders and tablets. Overhead lights cast everything in stark, fluorescent truth. The proceeding opened with formalities, oaths, and procedural language that made Thorne's skin itch. Then the questions began. They walked him through Damascus, step by step, from pre-mission brief to the final extraction. He answered each one with clinical precision, emotions stripped away, facts laid bare. The investigators presented communications logs showing RIA's awareness of compromised intelligence. They displayed satellite imagery that confirmed enemy positions inconsistent with the briefing. They entered testimony from signals analysts who'd flagged irregularities in the command chain that night. 3 hours in, they called a recess. Thorne stepped outside and found Commander Sable waiting with a bottle of water and a quiet update. "It's going well. The evidence is solid. They're going to recommend full exoneration for the team and a formal review of Blackwood's conduct." Thorne nodded. He felt strangely numb, as if the weight he'd carried for 16 years was lifting so slowly he couldn't quite process the absence. When they reconvened, the Secretary of the Navy made a brief statement. He acknowledged the failures that had allowed good men to die and their reputations to be tarnished. He announced that the official records would be corrected. Riley, Donovan, and Kramer would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Weston and Archer would have the blemishes removed from their service jackets, and Thomas Everett, call sign Iron Ghost, would be recognized for actions consistent with the highest traditions of naval service. The families were there. Riley's mother, gay-haired and weeping, Donovan's brother, holding his nephew's hand, Kramer's widow, her face a landscape of grief and relief, They received the folded flags, the medals, the apologies that could never be enough, but were offered anyway. Then Lana walked into the room carrying her cello. Nobody had announced this part. She'd asked Sable for permission, and Sable, understanding that some moments require more than words, had quietly arranged it. Lana sat, adjusted the cello between her knees, and began to play the adagio. The room fell into absolute stillness. The notes moved through the space like a living thing, finding the grief and the honor and the love that bound these broken people together. When she finished, there was no applause, just silence. The kind of silence that holds everything. Thorne stepped to the microphone for the first time. He spoke 4 sentences, his voice steady, but raw. Honor belongs to the ones who didn't come home. They made the right calls. They paid the price. We're here to make sure people remember that. Afterward, there were handshakes, quiet words, the kinds of gestures that try to bridge the unbridgeable. Thorne found himself holding Riley's mother as she sobbed into his shoulder, whispering, "Thank you," over and over. He held Donovan's brother, who'd been 7 years old the last time he saw his sibling alive. He stood with Kramer's widow and looked at the medal she'd waited 16 years to receive. Weston clapped him on the back. Archer squeezed his shoulder, and Lana stood to the side. Cello at rest, watching her father become whole in a way she hadn't understood he'd been broken. Rhea Blackwood left the adjacent conference room 40 minutes after the main proceeding ended. She looked exactly as she had in Hangar 4, poised, fit, immaculate, in uniform. But the press waiting outside told a different story. Cameras tracked her movement. Reporters shouted questions she didn't answer. By evening, the official statement would land. Admiral Blackwood placed on administrative leave, pending expanded investigation into command decisions related to Operation Damascus. Inside, the hallway emptied slowly. Thorne was one of the last to leave. He walked past the portraits of former Navy leaders, men and women who'd navigated impossible choices and lived with the consequences. He was almost to the exit when he saw her. Rhea stood near a side corridor, flanked by 2 Navy lawyers, but momentarily alone. Their eyes met for a long moment. Neither moved. Then Thorne did something that surprised even himself. He stopped, came to attention, and rendered a salute. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't defiance. It was acknowledgement. A statement that despite everything, the uniform still meant something, and the chain of command still held weight, even when individuals failed it. Rhea's face flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Then, almost against her will, she returned the salute. The gesture was stiff, reluctant, but it was there. When she lowered her hand, Thorne spoke, his voice carrying just far enough. Sometimes courage is staying quiet, but today courage was telling the truth. Rhea held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she turned and walked away, her lawyers closing ranks around her. Thorne continued outside where Lana and Sable were waiting by a government sedan. The drive back to West Haven took 6 hours. They stopped once for gas and coffee. Lana slept in the back seat for most of it, her cello secured beside her. Thorne drove in silence, watching the landscape shift from federal buildings to suburbs to the open stretches of highway that eventually led home. By the time they pulled into the boatyard, the sun was setting. Adria waved from the porch of the office. The shop lights were on. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. Lana stirred awake and yawned. "We home?" "We're home." They climbed out of the car, stretched, and stood for a moment in the fading light. Somewhere in Washington, lawyers were drafting official language. Somewhere in West Haven, Principal Finch was scheduling a press conference to announce the arts program had been saved. And somewhere, deep in the classified archives, 3 names were being moved from one column to another. Shame replaced with honor. 16 years too late, but not too late to matter. Thorne looked at his daughter. She looked back and smiled. "You did good, Dad," So did you. They went inside together, father and daughter, and closed the door on the hardest day of their lives. 3 weeks later, the boatyard settled back into its familiar rhythm. The afternoon sun cut through the gaps in the shed's walls, illuminating dust motes that drifted like snow in the still air. The smell of salt and engine oil was a constant, comforting in its reliability. Lana sat on a crate near the water's edge, playing something new. Not the Adagio anymore, but a lighter piece, something with hope threaded through the notes. Weston and Archer had driven up for the weekend. They sat at a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood, drinking beer from bottles, sweating in the June heat. The Damascus coin rested beside the folded flag. Objects that had been hidden for so long now resting in plain sight. There was a knock at the gate. Thorne looked up, tensed for a moment out of habit, then relaxed when he saw who it was. A man in his early 30s, tall and sun-weathered, stood beside a woman and 3 young adults, Adrea's brother, and behind him the other hostages from that night, no longer children, but carrying the memory of childhood terror in the lines around their eyes. They didn't say much at first. The brother stepped forward, extended his hand, and when Thorne took it, pulled him into an embrace that lasted long enough to say everything words couldn't. The woman, who'd been 9 years old when Thorne carried her 11 kilometers through hostile territory, cried quietly. One of the young men, who'd been 6, just stood and stared like he was seeing a myth made flesh. They stayed for an hour. They thanked him, though Thorne kept insisting there was nothing to thank. They met Lana, who was gracious and shy in equal measure. They stood at the water's edge and watched the boats move in and out of the harbor while the sun dropped toward the horizon. Before they left, the brother pressed something into Thorne's hand, a photograph creased and faded, showing 4 faces, 3 of them children. One of them, a young man in fatigues, whose features were barely visible in the darkness, but whose presence was unmistakable. "We never forgot," the brother said simply. After they left, Commander Sable arrived out of uniform, carrying a 6-pack and a question. "The Navy wants to know if you'd consider coming back, consulting, training, something low profile. You've still got skills they need." Thorne shook his head, smiling for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I'm good here. You sure you could do a lot of good?" "I am doing good." He gestured to Lana, to the boatyard, to the quiet life he'd built. "This is where I'm supposed to be." Sable nodded, unsurprised. "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, you've got people who'd be glad to have you back." She raised her beer in a toast. To the ghosts who came home. They drank. The sun finally slipped below the harbor, turning the water gold and then copper, and then dark. Lana finished her piece and set the cello aside. She came to stand beside her father, shoulder to shoulder, watching the same horizon. "Think she'll ever apologize? Blackwood, I mean." Thorne considered it. "Maybe, but I don't need her to. The truth is out. That's enough." In Washington, Rhea Blackwood sat in a quiet office reviewing her options with lawyers who charged by the hour. Her phone buzzed once with a message she drafted and deleted a dozen times before finally sending. It said only, "Thank you." Thorne saw the message when he checked his phone later that night. He read it twice, thought about responding, then set the phone down and didn't. Some conversations didn't need an answer. The next morning, Thorne woke early and walked down to the water. The first light was just breaking over the harbor, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. He stood at the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets, and thought about Riley and Donovan and Kramer. He thought about the weight of command, the cost of decisions, the price of silence. And for the first time in 16 years, the weight felt lighter. Not gone. It would never be gone, but lighter, manageable. Lana appeared beside him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She passed him one without a word. They stood together, father and daughter, watching the boats begin their slow procession out to sea. You know what the best part is? Lana asked. What's that? You don't have to be a ghost anymore. Thorne smiled. Really. Smiled. And it felt like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. No, I guess I don't. Behind them, the boatyard hummed to life. Weston and Archer loaded gear into Archer's truck, preparing for the drive back to their own lives. Adria arrived to open the office. The town began to wake, oblivious to the quiet miracle that had taken place in its midst. Somewhere in the distance, a bell buoy rang in rhythm with the tide. Lana lifted her coffee and a mock toast to Iron Ghost. May he rest in peace. Thorne clinked his mug against hers, and to the people he gets to be now. They drank. The light grew stronger. The water turned from gray to blue, and Thomas Everett, father and boat mechanic, formerly known as Iron Ghost, stood on the edge of West Haven Harbor and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, like a man who'd finally come home.